Okay. Good afternoon. Hello, my name is Annika Schröder. I work with Miserio. Wait. So there was a mic on. And now, hello, good afternoon to anyone here at COP and for those assisting from home via the live stream. My name is Annika Schröder. I work with Miserio, which is a church-based development organization running around 2,000 projects around the world. And we don't have one of it which is not being affected by the severe impacts of climate change right now. We do run many urban programs around the world with the aim of protecting the rights of informal settlers who don't have any rights to the city right now. And they do fight evictions each and every day and need to fear that they are being thrown away from their way they live. I just get the information that people don't hear me in the room. So can any one of the technicians fix the difficulties, please? Shall I go ahead? I just keep on talking and you tell me if the voice is getting better in the room. No, it is not. I'm so sorry for it. So now thank you so much to the technician team. I'm not sure where you left my voice. However, I just introduced my organization, which is a church-based development organization. And along many other things, we also work a lot to ensure, protect and guarantee the human rights of informal settlers in the cities worldwide. And we do have two important partner organizations of ours with us, which I'm going to introduce later on. So welcome to our side event, Urban Settlers in the Climate Crisis, the potential of community-based adaptation and resilience action. We feel that this is a really important side event to take place at COP27, as many discussions are going on about loss and damage for people in the low-lying islands, about agriculture, about people who struggle from severe droughts and severe floodings also in urban settlements, but still the bubbles of the climate scene on the one hand side and the bubble of the climate scene on the other hand side are not well connected. And this counts true for the science, this counts true to politics, and this is true for civil society organizations around the world. So this side event is meant to be a bridge builder between the climate and the urban expert world. And this is why online we do have many people from the urban scene as well who were not able to join here but who are going to assist from home and learn. So today we have our distinguished panelist Anumita Rochohuri. I hope that I spelled it right. I practiced a lot. And she works with the Center for Science and Environment, I think since decades. And she's the program coordinator and one of the experts in urban development and climate politics. So I'm so delighted to have you with us. And Anumita is going to start with a key speech in the beginning. And then we are going to follow up with a panel discussion. And Samuel Orlando will be part of it. He works with Pamoja Trust in Kenya. And Pamoja Trust works in 4 cities around the country to ensure a poor-based approaches in development. But so delighted to have you with us, especially as we have an African COP here, and we're delighted to have an African partner from the urban area with us. So we were planning to have another partner on board from HIC Latin America, the Housing International Coalition, but unfortunately, due to personal reasons, she was not able to join on the last mile. She, together with other friends from Latin America, prepared a great video with many photo materials and statements, what they need should be tackled here. However, this video did not went through yesterday. So, you know, wherever we have difficulties, creativity grows. So after the input of Anamita, we will have a panel discussion, not only with Samuel, but we do have a free share. And this free share could be used by you distinguished observers of the event, and you can just join the discussion and bring in your specific expertise or your specific questions to the panel here. And I think this is what side events should be about in the end. It is about dialogue and discussion. Before taking even more time, I would like to hand over the floor to Anamita, and we're so much looking forward to hear. She will give a really, really insightful presentation about urbanization as well, as we feel that so much knowledge on this is being missed in this space.
Thank you so much, Annika, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here today with all of you. And particularly keeping in mind that we are today discussing an issue which is truly emerging as one of the most dramatic human story in this decade and the coming decades to follow. And it is about the cities. And most of people who live in cities, and we know how every year the media is awash with horrifying tales and stories of absolute devastation because of extreme weather events, and that is, bashing the cities year after year, and the floods, the extreme heat. And today the question is that cities that are part of the problem also now need to adapt to the problem. And therefore, how do we begin to understand those dimensions so that we know how to develop our roadmap to adapt, mitigate, and align the two together? So if I just quickly go through some of the slides, and so these are the images that we see every year, and look at not the scale, but also the spread of the problem. So from nearly all cities of the developing world today, whether that is in Asia, whether that's in Africa, and is that Dhaka, Jakarta, Bangalore, Delhi, and we see this kind of problem emerging all the time. IPCC, in its very recent report, has also tried to map the risks in the cities and what are the adaptation options. And here you can see that from sea level rise to heat to floods to extreme rains to, it's a range of, and then look at the gravity and the magnitude of the problem across cities. And therefore, what is it that we need to do and the number of people that are affected by that? More data is coming out constantly in the Asian cities, the kind of extreme heats that is developing. If you look at some of the cities in India today, they are now mapping that how extreme rainfall, the extreme temperature, all the temperature trends that are changing, and just look at some of the very recently, when we crunched the information for India. Just imagine between January 1 and September 30th this year, we had 241 extreme weather events in 273 days, which means 88% of the days we had one extreme weather event. Now just imagine therefore what it means. And when you begin to look at the data more carefully, that how the land mass in the cities are absorbing the heat and how that is increasing over time. It's all there between 2014 and 2022. Just see how much warmer and hotter the city of Delhi is. And not only that, and this is where some of the insight come for how planning needs to happen in our city. So when you map the heat in the city, you realize that there are hot spots, but there are also cold spots. And the cold spots, actually colder spots, which actually align with the where you have more greens, more vegetation. But the more built up area are even more warmer. And that's where the most of the poor people live, because that's where you have built it up so much that you have no green space left in that area. So today we are all worried that cities where you have the maximum people living and the 70% of the world population and urban settlements are going to be there by 2050. So many more people, so if more people are coming to the city and the cities are facing resource scarcity, that means that they are the ones who are vulnerable to water shortage, to the flooding, to disease, to health risk around all the climate risk. And keep in mind that today 90% of urban areas in the world, they say, are actually close to the coast. So this is something that we really have to understand the vulnerability. But when we talk about vulnerability, this is the most poignant image from India when pandemic happened. And suddenly we found this enormous migration taking place. And this is the invisible masses. We were not even clear, didn't even know that they exist. But then there are. And today, when we know that the kind of climate change related migration that is happening in our cities, look at Bangladesh, for instance, where they're saying 7 people in Bangladesh will be displaced by one out of every 7 person will be replaced by 2050. I mean, imagine, therefore, how the cities are going to be burdened, where the coping strategies of the migrants are going to be even weaker than the people who already live in those cities. Now, clearly, we can blame the climate and the climate change for that. But we also have to understand that a lot of the blame will also have to be apportioned to all the mistakes that we are making in urban planning. So today, if the whole built-up structures in India or other parts of the world are actually disregarding the ecology of the area, if we are building against the drainage, I'm just showing this one image in Chennai, where the entire airport has been built on the drainage of a river. In fact, the lakes are disappearing, the water bodies are disappearing, they cannot absorb that extra water that we require. And the other big problem is that because of the inequity in the way we are using the land in our city, so you have this dense urban periphery which is unlivable. That's where the low-income groups live. And then you have the sprawling areas which are very low density. And not only that, in that whole urban planning, we are now pushing the migrants and the poorer people out of the central city. And which means that you are actually disempowering them because they do not then have the access to the basic services. And all the mapping that we are doing, that today whether the slum population, even if you are giving them better house to live, but that is outside the city and without the basic services to fend for. And then they come back to the city once again. So therefore, the similar pattern that emerges, that the services that we are providing for the urban people, and so when the vulnerability is so huge and the access to service is so weak, that is compounding the inhuman misery. And also in the whole planning process, if you take a city like this, even where you are providing water, just look at the inequity in the distribution of that water. So the amount of water that you're giving to the poor neighborhoods per the liter per capita per day is much less, several times lower than what is going to the affluent areas. Now, therefore, if the inequity is built in, and there is no circularity, because the whole resource management is not about providing resource, but it is also about bringing the circularity to not to have this kind of waste dumps, because these are the backyards of the low-income neighborhoods, which are hugely diseased. Now, this is the whole infrastructure that is going wrong, because the moment the air condition and the car is the basis of the urban planning, that means you are creating a system which is unsolvable. This is cutting off access of the people. And this is here the city is getting designed for the car and not for the people. And similarly for the buildings. When you look at the building like this, these are the buildings that have been built in different cities, but in complete disregard of how the local architecture needs to be integrated to build thermal comfort for everyone. And so you are creating these heat trappers which are actually making it even more thermally uncomfortable. The road design is going all wrong. So the people who need right access, so imagine therefore this kind of infrastructure is not only taking us away from sustainable mobility, which is car centric, but this infrastructure is also aggravating the flood situations in city today because they are all against the basic drainage channels that you need to be looking at. So final segment that I just want to highlight, that even though cities are turning out to be a problem because of the extreme weather events, the pressure that is building up because of the migration inequity, but cities are not a bad word. Cities can also be the opportunity for change because cities are where we are making the maximum investment today in the infrastructure building. But if we do it the right way immediately, then we can prevent enormous lock-in of carbon, which contributes to mitigation. But we can also make more livable cities, which contributes towards adaptation. So instead of making those ugly, monstrous glass houses in the cities of the developing world, but when you adopt the local architectural wisdom to bring in the thermal comfort for everyone. And this is not for the people of the rich. It's interesting to see that how the narrative is changing. There are several cities today where now the professional architectural services are being provided to the poor people who can therefore produce more thermally comfortable buildings and adapt. It's fascinating to see when we go to the coastal towns of India today and see that how they are adopting techniques to make their houses, which are like this, more resilient to the storm. And they're tying it up with the fishing nets. Now they are trying to survive, but it is possible to actually adapt those buildings to make them more resilient if you provide the right scientific input to doing that design. Similarly, if you look at the local neighborhoods today across, now the resource saving and waste management that are now being decentralized, which essentially means that these are some of the neighborhoods where people have come together in a participatory manner, where communities are designing that how to treat the wastewater. So the wastewater during flooding, which actually gets mixed up even with drinking water, and cause huge amount of disease. Now that can be prevented if proper localized, decentralized sanitation systems like this are created in the neighborhoods. Similarly, catch rainwater where it falls. Now we talk about flooding, but at the same time we talk about water scarcity. Now if we can capture that water, and now design solutions are possible, and we are seeing now city after city where people are making the change. So where you had the flooding, and then with the right intervention and the right kind of water harvesting systems, they are capturing that water and improving the water security. Similarly, the cool roof program in cities today to cool down the buildings, and that too of the poor people. And these are all measurable. So the moment you do water harvesting system, you can actually measure how the groundwater resource is going up. And that is the investment inputs that we want to give in. So this is all it's a whole micro resource management that we are beginning to see in the different neighborhoods of the city, which means we need a lot more hyper-local intervention now, where people themselves begin to participate in that resource management. And that gives you an enormous opportunity. We talk about road building and the wrong road building, but just look at it, that the same road that you are building for the cars today, if you bring in this design elements where the drainage along the roadside, they also become the soaking points of the water. And the flooding that happens during extreme weather events, that water then can be conserved, absorbed, but the whole road infrastructure design is changing, which means if therefore, whether that's a climate finance or the local domestic finance, wherever you are investing in infrastructure, these indicators for adaptation will have to be integrated with those infrastructure. Waste is not a waste, but a resource if you bring it back to use it again. Look at what is possible, the construction waste today, because cities are growing and the construction is today explosive. And the waste that the construction generates, we are throwing it away. In fact, these are being thrown into ecologically sensitive areas like wetlands and in the forest areas and destroying the environment. But if you just take that waste back and make new resource out of it, so that is actually the whole circularity that can help you to mitigate and at the same time adapt. The final point that I just want to make in the case of mobility, we have seen that cities today that are growing, especially in the developing world, whether that is Africa, whether that is in Asia, we are sprawling. And yet we know from the different cities of the world that when you build compact, high density, but properly built cities, and those who have more access to public transport system, you can see that how the carbon's intensity goes down and the percentage share of use of sustainable mobility goes up. So even so you will find that the cities that are sprawling more in the northern world, like you go to Rome, to the Sydney, Toronto, Johannesburg, whichever the sprawls, that's where you see the use of public transport lower than those where you have like Hong Kong, Singapore. They are high density, compact city. They keep distances low and reduce the usage of car. Today, a city like Delhi, after having its entire public transport system, it will be a 15-minute walking city. And therefore, in fact, the 80% of the urban dwellers will be living within 400 meters of the transit infrastructure. So therefore, understand the power of that and opportunity of that change, that if the infrastructure is designed in that manner, then that makes the city accessible for all. Now, this is the kind of world-class cities we require, that is people-oriented. And this is the design that we need to look at to be able to make that difference. And we are seeing this change not just in Asia, but even Africa doing this so right. If you look at Nairobi today, Lagos and Kampala, there are a whole range of examples where they're undoing and reversing the whole automobile car-centric infrastructure to more people-oriented infrastructure. And that's the change that we really want to look for. So my final point is that there is a big agenda in front of us, that today when the infrastructure plans are being made, huge investments are being planned by the national governments, and now this will also become part of the climate finance. And more important, the fact that this COP is going to see a transportation declaration, I think on 16th or 17th, towards the end of this COP. Now, that whole focus is going to be on that how do we design the city. So let us therefore understand that this whole huge scale of devastation that awaits us, that we can actually turn that negative into a positive, provided and keeping in mind that cities in the developing world are beginning to grow now. And as we grow, as we urbanize, as we motorize, we have the opportunity to do it the right way. So if we right away from the beginning start mapping the vulnerability, develop our policy measures, regulations, regulatory framework, and infrastructure development at municipal level to be able to integrate all these elements. We reorient the funding and align climate funding with adaptation indicators for infrastructure development, improve migrant adaptive capacity, create new livelihood opportunities, and diversify income around the activities that we are going to undertake for adaptation as well as mitigation, and adopt compact urban form, reduce infrastructure degradation, integrate the whole needs for urban everything that we are talking about today, and sensitize not only the governments but also the non-state actors, and as particularly the adaptation strategy and agenda will have to be fought with community participation and community engagement to meet their requirements. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anumita, for this rich presentation and your message to integrate adaptation and mitigation into urban planning rather than doing adaptation and mitigation projects in certain streams. Thank you so much for this presentation. And I would now invite, there's a fly on my nose the whole day while I'm sitting here. So it might be that they love my cream or whatever. It's quite annoying. so I'm a little bit irritated. Samuel, you work in Nairobi and some other cities of the country, and I assume that many of the presented challenges and opportunities are quite familiar for you. I've seen you nicking all the time and like being reminded. May you tell us a little bit about the approach and the aims of your organization in Kenya?
Thank you so much, Annika. I'd like to approach your question from 3 different points. The first one is what it is now. Then secondly, the approach that we are taking as a nation in dealing, but then lastly, what it ought to be from our perspective as an organization. So as introduced, I'm Orlando Samuel from Pamoja Trust. We are based in Nairobi, Kenya. Nairobi, among other cities in Kenya, is rapidly urbanizing, and we've got approximately 60 to 70% of our urban population living in informal settlements. We call them informal settlements because the housing standards do not meet particular regulations that have been set by the city authority. And as pointed out by my co-panelist, you notice that the informal settlements bear the brunt on the effects of climate change. One being the surface water runoff, particularly the flooding, that is affecting a number of settlements across Nairobi. Other than that, water scarcity that is being occasioned by resource scarcity, and this is basically because of the rural to urban population that the city is witnessing. And in dealing with this, there have been various approaches that have been sought by government that, from my perspective and other practitioners, we feel may disenfranchise majority of the urban population. One of the approaches that have been sought has been that approach that seeks to privatize what I may call the public good, and this do not incentivize the urban population to be able to engage with these services. For instance, in the water sector, you will notice that it is being managed by a private company. We also go to the element of the transport sector, which in most occasions are being managed by private companies. So that then the extent to which the government then comes in as a regulator is being impeded, because in many occasions the interventions are driven by, by profit, and not other than the profit only, but also the ability that is that's being driven by forces of demand and supply. I want to give an example of the water sector and how resource scarcity impact on the low-income earners. You notice that a 40-liter jerrycan of water is approximately $1, when at the same time the estimated average income per household on a daily basis is $3. So then if a family then expends $1 to access water, then you notice the extent to which the effects of climate change are impacting to the household level. So that then in the long run, then the ability of this particular household to be able to access other services then becomes a little bit problematic. So then, to what extent can the government intervene? From our perspective and that of Pamoja Trust, we contend that there are particular values that should be anchored in urban development. And that as we seek to build climate resilient cities, then human rights-based approaches then should be the center bolt that then these oscillate around. And we argue that that urban development and building climate resilient cities should be in the context of adaptive planning that take into consideration the innovations that are coming from the communities to deal with the challenges that they experience in terms of climate change on a day-to-day basis. And these values cut across elements of participation, elements of innovations of communities, elements of social justice, elements of equity, and how communities adapt to deal with their day-to-day challenges. So that then we legitimize this through policy documents and breathe life into them, other than then imposing what us policymakers may think is the antidote to the challenges that the communities face. So I'd love to leave it at there first, Annika. Thank you.
Thanks, Samuel. When I think of Kenya and the media reporting that's taking place about the impacts of climate change, they are extremely severe. And I think about droughts in the countryside, and I think about cows and cattle lying in the desert being dead in this year because of the high water shortages. And I see all the stories of people suffering on the countryside. But I rarely see reports about what's happening in the cities. So I would like to be interested to know what is your biggest fear, or what you see the biggest threat to urban settlers right now from the climate change impacts.
My biggest fear to urban settlers is the cost of living, because in Kenya there's a close relationship between the urban and the rural, that in most occasions you find the urban being fed by the rural in terms of foodstuff. So that then the informal markets that we have then depend on the rural for purchase, and then ultimately they end up to the informal market that then trade within the city. So that when the rural is affected and what you see being reported in the media, then the cost of living within the cities skyrocket, and it becomes untenable for a number of households. And as I did mention earlier, you notice that with $3 being the estimated average income of a household, then they'll not be able to sustain the life at the city. But then other than that, majority of the informal settlements sit on high-risk areas that are prone to flooding, areas that are on the riverbanks and such. So that when the city experiences flooding, because they're on the lowlands, then in most occasions, then you find the houses flooded. You find, a number of community, waterborne diseases affecting a large number of communities and such. So that then, when you want to respond to that, then you respond to it through, an adaptive way where you need to do relocations, you need to do resettlements, and you need to allow communities then be able to settle in areas that can then give them the dignity that they so desire as communities.
Mm-hmm. So the main problem you said is that the people cannot afford their living anymore. Is it especially due to food?
It's due to food scarcity, but among other factors, because of the cost of living that has also skyrocketed due to the effects of climate change, particularly affecting majority of the rural parts of the nation, but then how that feeds into the urban. But also what happens is now that you witness a lot of rural-urban migration, because majority of the population were depending on agri-business, but now being that it's no longer tenable, then they come to the cities as spaces in which they can innovate, they can find a livelihood, and they can also be able to access decent jobs. Mm-hmm. So then we have got a population badge within the urban informal settlements that keep on growing, and it is estimated that by 2050 we may have half of our population living in urban areas.
Mm-hmm. I think right now it's around 20% of the population. It's not
now
highly urbanized.
It's approximately 25%.
25% of populations, but it's going to grow. And in many, many other countries, we see a discussion about how can we prepare cities to adapt for so many internally displaced people by climate change. Where do they go? Because most of them go to cities. Is there anyone working in Kenya about ideas how to build up spaces in the urban that are decent and provide a decent life to the people?
I think our approach has been dealing with the problem as is now, other than a futuristic view of saying that we may have urban sprawl that is being caused by the effects of climate change, and how do we plan for this. But I also foresee where we will be urbanizing at the county nodes, particularly at the towns that host a number of local governments, and the ability of these local governments to be able to take care of this is now because they have not as urbanized as the four cities that we have. So that then as we urbanize at that particular level, then it is already planned, and it's already, foresee the effects of climate change and the population bulge that will come with it.
Mm-hmm. And aside from your organization, is the government or other CSOs looking into the issue of climate change not only as reactive activities, but also starting to look on the long term?
Yes, there are. From a government perspective, I can say yes, the government is dealing with it through the context of developing adaptation strategies and mitigation strategies. But we also have a number of civil society organizations from the various sectors, be it the land sector, be it the housing sector, be it the climate governance sector, who have got this view. However, we've not approached it from an urban perspective and the effects that it may portend to the city. And I think the conversations that we've had at COP then will bring this now into fore on how we build integrated settlements and how these settlements can then respond to the effects of climate change.
Thank you so much. So coming from this discussion right now, I see a strong need for the international community, for the support sector, for the financial instruments of the United Nations conventions and the bilateral and multilateral aid to take into account the urban settings in a better way. And I wonder what we could do to make this happen, to have more inclusive support of informal settlements. So whomever does have an idea or ask to politicians or how to address it here in the negotiations is welcomed to join the seat here and to present its ideas or its research on it or its practical experience. As far as I see nobody who wants to share, please don't hesitate to do it while we talk further. I just got the notice that the video arrived here safely and that we could now start it. Okay, not yet. 5 minutes. Okay. So we do have the opportunity to have a panel discussion here. The perspective of Miseria always is to enhance and to guarantee, protect human rights for the urban settlers. And as far as we observe in many, many settings around the world, urban settlers don't have rights. Whenever an infrastructure project starts, they are never being contacted before, they are never being informed about what's happened, and they are forcibly evicted from one day to another. And this happens when roads are being built. And I know that you have a great example how this even accelerates the risks for the local communities. I will ask you to share it later. And on the other hand side, we do fear that the same things happen when climate change investments are taking place, not only in regards to mitigation, when train rails are being built, but also when it comes to adaptation. And we already have really bad stories from the ground, for example, from the Philippines, where dams are being built on the places where the informal settlers are living right now. And those dams are there to protect the areas of the rich or of the economy. So we see a high rate of accelerating the problems of the informal settlers due to climate action already. And I wonder how if you have some more examples for me, and later on we could discuss what could be done to avoid those threats for the communities. But please start with the road construction in your area where you work.
Thank you. I think climate change investments, particularly as normally come in terms of mega infrastructure development programs, sometimes the construction of dams or actions that may seek to mitigate the effects of climate change. One of the things that we notice happening is that it normally comes with a lot of displacements. And with the displacements, then you make the already vulnerable communities more vulnerable because it's normally in the sense of large-scale land acquisition processes. But other than that, then it's also in many occasions.
Tell us an example.
I can give an example of construction of dams, and I can give Itare Dam, Tiba Dam in Kenya, and many more dams in Kenya. So then what happens is that when you displace, in most occasions you disrupt sources of livelihoods. For instance, it may be pastoralism, as a source of livelihood for, for a community, be it the Turkana community, be it the Pokot community in Kenya, and many more. So then, if you don't, from a point of integrating this in your planning, then you notice that climate change investment programs, it causes more vulnerability to to those whom they intend to support, and this has affected a number of communities. Within urban communities, when we construct particular road infrastructure development programs, in most occasions when we plan, we assume that the urban areas are bare and that there's no one who lives there, so that it's not adaptive in nature. So that when we go to seek for support in terms of bilateral financing, then the plans that we submit to those whom we intend to support the work that we do in terms of infrastructure development, we give plans not having in mind that there are people settling in these areas already. So that to what extent do we have in our plans mitigation strategies to the effects of this infrastructure development programs. And in Nairobi, I know a number of communities have been affected by this. Now we are speaking about housing in urban informal settlements. And what we are doing is that we are getting into conversations with donors, including the World Bank and other investment banks, to come and invest in housing and have an engagement with the population and also the Kenya Mortgage Refinancing Company. But then what happens is that when we implement this, we displace. And when we displace, in most occasions, those who have been displaced are unable to benefit from the housing because they are unable to afford. They are already very vulnerable, and they do not have the ability to be able to repay the loans that are required so that you benefit from the housing program. And this has happened in Kibra Informal Settlement, one of the biggest informal settlements in Kenya, Soweto East Zone A, which was a World Bank funded program, and Soweto East Zone B. So that in the long run, then we may have even market-based evictions, because majority of these residents will be unable to sustain the cost of living within that particular neighborhood, or leave alone be able to service the repayment schedule of the houses that they settle on. So in my view, we need to embed in the climate financing approaches that also allow the end users to be able to benefit, and the safeguards that are there in are followed to the latter to ensure that they are not made more vulnerable by the actions that we take to mitigate.
Thank you. And Amita, from your experience in India and some cases or internationally, what do you think are the most important standards or actions that need to be in place to make sure that no evictions and no lowering of resilience of the urban dwellers are taking place due to climate action?
So it's very important for us now to understand that how do we develop the right indicators that need to inform your investment plans, and that will deliver on the adaptation of the the low income groups and the marginalized and the needs of the adaptation. Now, to answer your question, let me just give you some of the examples that when you're looking at it internationally, then what we just heard from Kenya as well, that how do we minimize dislocation and destabilization of the communities. Let me give you one example. One, that when we are designing and planning the settlements, and the investments are planned for that. And I know internationally when we are talking about climate finance and therefore how that needs to flow, that's one level of discussion, that the how and where the finance needs to come. But internally at the local level, we need to understand that there are many aspects of planning that will have to be mandated to ensure that these are not disregarded when you're implementing that. For example, today, a lot of social housing projects, I'm sure in Kenya, in India, everywhere, the governments are coming up those projects. But when you look at the actual planning and design of those projects, what you realize that they have not taken into account the community requirements. And as a result, so these are designed as the way you and I live, but maybe not the way the other different occupational groups live. So recently in Mumbai city, we saw that it is actually a potter's colony. But when they did the rehabilitation and reconstruction of their housing, they uh, they just did it like, 2 rooms and no common spaces, but they require a common area to be able to do their pottery. Now, but no one has ever thought of that. How do you integrate that? Similarly, when now if the government policies are not therefore aligned with these requirements, then internationally, wherever the financing is coming from and the matrix and the framework that we are going to develop now for the adaptation funds and the adaptation requirements, then we are going to miss out on all those. And instead of minimizing the distress of the people, we are going to further aggravate it. And we have also learned now that when you're coming up with a financial model, it is important that the incentive structures that you are creating for the developers, for the construction agencies to provide social housing, now they are being given incentive in terms of extra floor area ratio or floor space index that they can get if they provide for the low income groups. So it's a huge incentive because they get a lot of extra land to build. But this incentive today, and these are fiscal incentives, these are not linked with the performance. And the performance from the perspective of sustainability that we are all talking about today. So they are taking those incentives, building houses, but they are using wrong material, wrong design. The buildings themselves are becoming heat trappers, and which requires lot more mechanical air conditioning, cooling, which increases the carbon intensity of the structure and thermal discomfort for the people who need to adapt. So this means that now we have to completely come up with a new fiscal instruments which will be able to have these performance linked indicators, and the performance from the perspective of sustainability, thermal comfort, access to service, those will have to be part of the mandate for the fiscal instrument.
And what could the international community, be it NGOs, be it the financial architecture, do to support India and other countries, of course, around the world to take a more pro-poor, more integrated approach to urban planning?
How do we make them?
And what kind of role are playing those sectors outside of India?
I think there is an enormous opportunity in the experience sharing and learning from each other. And I feel that in this, the South-South conversation has to be made much stronger. You are experimenting with your opportunity. We are also experimenting. How do we create that learning curve for everyone to understand? Now, first is now how do you convince that why is it so? To argue for inclusive planning is not about just being taking a moral high ground that that we need to do this to save the world. It's not about that. People have to, and the policymakers and communities have to understand that the moment you are designing your city for enhanced adaptation, it is actually about more resource efficiency, much better economic efficiency, maximization of the public good and public benefits. And in the long run, it is actually saving a lot for your economy and while improving the overall welfare and well-being of the people. The problem is that we say all this, but we never demonstrate this with the right numbers. Like, for instance, when we say that you clean up the air of your city, so many lives will be saved. It is not just about how many people are going to die. It is about your saving life and your saving cost to the economy. Now we need to crunch those numbers and make it a more evidence-based change, make it more measurable to say that this kind of livability, welfare-based urban planning and inclusive urban planning is going to actually amplify our economic benefits as well, just not these social benefits. But there's a bigger issue here that so right now, there's a new generation policies are actually evolving in our part of the world. and in many countries of the world today. So when you say transit-oriented development, right? Now, yes, you need a transit and you need to build and bring people closer. But when you're doing that, we have to ensure that you're mandating that it should be mixed land use development so that you are not sprawling, but it also has to be mixed income group development as well. So that from that investment in transit, both poor and the affluent both can benefit. So I think there is a lot more case that we need to build for the global community today, and I think the case experiences that we have thrown across the world, that knowledge will have to be consolidated to play a much more powerful role in shaping policies in our part of the world.
Thank you so much. What you were telling right now reminds me of a campaign that Missouri have had in the last election, in the last national election, which was about justice is the smarter option. So
Yes.
whenever you serve the most poor of your society, it is to the benefit of all. And I think this is a perspective that we especially can take in the urban settlements, where we also build more inclusive cities that are more safe and healthier, and where one would love to sit. I always wonder how we as... So I challenge myself now. We as civil society always claim for mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage to finance to be added on top. And there is always the risk of having then programs that only should serve one of the different aims. And when I hear both of you talking, it's so integrated, especially in urban settings. But I know the same counts true for the environment. So what could we do? I mean, if urban planning should be financed by international finance institutions and programs and projects, how to do a proposal for adaptation if you want to include mitigation? Is it easy, or are different structures needed to serve?
I don't even want to keep adaptation and mitigation in different silos. I feel any development project have to address both together, right? And look at the opportunity in our part of the world, whether you look in Africa, whether you look at Asia. Imagine today, if I take India, where 70% of the people still walk, cycle, and use public transport. Only 10% of Indians use air conditioner, right? Now, I'm sure that's a case even in Africa.
Yes.
Now, when in that kind of a scenario, mitigation means keep people where they are and keep them do what they're doing. But you modernize that paradigm. So we use public transport, but we do not have to use those polluting, dilapidated buses, right? You modernize the bus system. So you give us good footpaths, you give us good cycling lanes, right? You build our houses in such a way that the thermal load on the building can be reduced through architectural design so that we don't have to switch on our air conditioner so much, right? So I feel that if we can design our development strategy in a way that prevents us from locking in carbon, which is mitigation, but it also helps to do an overall improvement in livability. In fact, pandemic was one of the major, it kind of was a lasting reminder for us. I still remember that when the pandemic happened, we were all told, please do not shut the doors and the windows and switch on your air conditioner. Even if your air conditioner is on, open the window. Because we realized that these tightly packed air-conditioned rooms, these are petri dishes for viruses and bacteria, right? Unhealthy living. So if the focus is on healthy living, livable living, it doesn't matter what you're doing, whether you're mitigating or you're adapting. Because if you do it well, it is addressing both the concerns.
Thank you. I just want to remind the audience again, if you have a story to share, an experience that you want to tell, or an idea how to better adapt to the needs of urban settlers in the climate crisis, there's a free share, and you can take the mic. And in case you don't want to be on the video, but you would like to raise a question or make a comment, please advise us, and Madeleine, my colleague over there, will bring the mic over. There's a question.
Thank you. Thank you,
And
madam.
then, sorry, there's another one behind you. If you can just handle it over later. Okay.
Yes, perfect.
It
Thank
was
you.
a bit earlier.
Thank you, Anika, and thank you, Madam Anumita.
Do you switch it on, please?
Hello.
Yes,
Okay,
it
it is
works.
working now. So I'm Nakul Sharma from Climate Action Network South Asia, and I completely agree with the assessment of how urban planning has in itself become a sort of it has become fixed in its own problem. The solutions which urban areas are supposed to give in terms of livelihood, in terms of shelter, in terms of food security, they are not they are not being able to cope up with them. uh, Two points that I want to mention, not in a particular order, but one is a solution and one is a query that you might want to shed light on. First thing on, we see in the global south there are conflict between institutional agencies. For an example, let's take a case of any new urban planning area or satellite cities which come up near the major metropolitan cities. There are two departments which are you know keenly involved in the start of it. One is the land and revenue department, which is basically have a mandate of allocating lands for various types of uses, and then after land is allocated, after the mess is done, then it is up to the urban civic bodies to undo the things and make sure that the civic services works in the best possible way. So where is the scope, do you think? Is there a scope, and if there is, where is the scope for having convergence in this institutional mismatch? And the second point is that if there is, then what is the scope of resource-centric regional planning at the start of it? You said that mixed economy or mixed livelihood mechanisms should be the centerpiece of our solutions. But then at the start of it, if we are allocating, if we plan to make a urban city, we can do necessary changes to cities that are existing. But if we are planning to come up with a new city, I think we have to start at regional level. We have to look, what are the best possible resource which are, native of those lands, and we have to use those resources. We don't have to cut copy paste solutions and even expectations and aspirations, so that we at the end of the day don't mess up. So these 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you. I take the second one, and then we have the turn to respond. Madeleine?
Thank you very much. So I work with Catholic Relief Services, and one of the things that we do is building sustainable homes. And during the design of those projects, we are very intentional about having climate smart buildings. And my question stroke point is very relevant to what he said, in the sense of that there's already been a lot of investment in big cities like Mumbai, Chennai, and African cities as well, such that I'm now thinking, what is the process of transitioning? So I come from Zambia, and like Kenya is sort of ahead of us in that space. Wangari Maathai has been, championing.
Sorry, I'm just recognizing that we have 1.5 minutes left.
Okay.
So in case 1 point and.
Okay.
Then
So then how is a cost-effective transition of existing cities in terms of the planning and the financing? What does that model look like? Yeah.
Thank you so much. And just one sentence.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. And my question is the management of the rainwater for the infrastructure and the assessment of the environmental and the social assessment when they build infrastructure such as roads and infrastructure is the main key. It's the key of adaptation for the
Thank you. Thanks for your perspectives. There will be room to clarify on your questions later on in small huddles around. We are about to close the session, unfortunately. What I would like to give you as take-home messages are mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage even cannot seen separate, especially not in the urban settings. So let's think about approaches that serve all three. And human rights matters. And human rights do not only matter to guarantee the rights of the people in place, but they also are a guarantee for projects that work in the end. Because if you don't take the experience of the local area, of the people into account, projects mostly fail. So there is a win-win situation when you look into climate change and human rights. With these two take-home messages, I would like to say goodbye and hope that you take those into all the discussions that you're going to have here at COP during the next days. I wish you a fruitful afternoon. Probably you are able to catch up with the march which is taking place, and shout out for more climate justice. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Distinguished panelists,
Thank you.
thank you so much for your contributions.
Thank you.